The key came over the top of the gate first, because Gilbert Ferrand would not open the gate. It fell into the frozen ruts of the public road and lay there, 7 inches of black iron with a wing of rust across the bow, and Harriet Ferrand had to go down on one knee in her only clean gown to pick it up. It was the 3rd of March, 1842, at the foot of the South Drive of Hallamere Court, in the wolds of Lincolnshire, and the frost had not come out of the ground by 11 in the morning. Everything Harriet owned stood behind her on the verge in a canvas bundle roped at the neck, 2 gowns, a grey shawl, a workbox, a tin candlestick, and her father's Bible. Her cousin stood on the gravel on the other side of the ironwork. Sir Gilbert Ferrand was 26 and had been a baronet for 11 months, and he had put on white gloves to do this, which she noticed and did not mention. "There is your key," he said, "and here is the deed. Mind the seal, it is soft yet." He passed the roll of parchment through the bars sideways, because it would not go through straight. It was engrossed on skin, folded once, and it carried a wafer of red wax the size of a crown piece, with the Ferrand griffin pressed into it, and it was, she thought, the handsomest thing anybody in that family had ever given her. "And £4, Gilbert said. He counted the sovereigns into her hand, one at a time, through the gap in the ironwork, and between each one she held her palm flat and open and empty, because he would not put 2 down together. £4. He kept the last one a moment longer than the others. "Count them, cousin. I should hate you to go about the parish saying we were mean." 20 yards up the drive the carriage stood with the horses steaming, and behind the glass sat Honoria, Dowager Lady Ferrand, in her widow's black with her hands in a muff, watching. She did not get down. In 3 years Harriet had learned to read that woman through a pane of glass the way a shepherd reads weather, and what she read that morning was not cruelty. It was tidiness. A thing was being finished, the way a bill is receipted. "You will want to know what you have got," Gilbert said, and he unrolled the deed against the top bar and read the middle of it aloud, in the voice young men use in a hall. All that messuage or dwelling house called the Dower House, in the parish of Netherwold, with the yard, garden, orchard, offices and appurtenances thereto belonging, containing 3 roods and 11 perches, together with all goods, chattels, furniture, plate, lumber, glass, ironwork, and other things whatsoever now being or remaining within the walls thereof, absolutely. He looked up over the parchment. "Nettles," he said. Absolutely 2 grooms were holding horses at the turn of the drive, and one of them laughed, and then stopped laughing. Then Gilbert read the last part, the part his mother had put in with her own hand, and he read it more slowly, because he did not entirely like it. "And the said Dowager Lady Ferrand doth hereby declare that no inventory of the said Dower House hath been made or shall be required, the same having been searched throughout in the year 1810, and found void of anything of value." "There," he said, rolling it up. "That is so nobody can ever stand in a market-place and say we kept back anything of yours. My mother was particular about it. She had it put in twice. Harriet Ferrand was 20 years old and thin from a winter of sleeping over a scullery, and she had exactly one thing to say, and she had been holding it since 7 o'clock that morning. "Thank you," she said. "You have been very exact." Then she took up her bundle and walked the 2.5 miles to Netherwold with the deed under her arm and the key in her fist, and she did not look back. because she knew the woman behind the glass would enter it in the account as an answer. To understand what was done to her that morning, you have to go back 68 years, to a marriage the county never forgave. Sir Ambrose Ferrand, 3rd Baronet of Hallamere, had 1,900 acres of thin-walled land, a house with 41 hearths, and a mortgage he could not carry. In 1774, he married Sabine Messman, the only child of Abraham Messman, a diamond merchant of Amsterdam who kept a counting house off Hatton Garden. She was 23. She spoke 4 languages, and the money that re-roofed the court and paid off the mortgage was hers. The county called her the Dutchwoman for 35 years, and it was never said kindly. Her portion did not come in land, and it did not come in the funds. Her father did not trust English land, and he trusted English husbands rather less, and by the settlement of the 3rd of June 1774, what he gave to her sole and separate use, free from the control of any husband, and he gave most of it in the only commodity he thought honest: stones out of his own stock, unset and uncut, with the invoice and the certificate of the House of Mesman and Zoon of Amsterdam. She had 2 sons. Roland was the heir. Edmund, born in 1780, was the 2nd son, which in that family meant a hint about the church, and he took orders and became curate of Withern Parva at £90 a year, and married a schoolmaster's daughter for love, and had 1 child late, in 1821. Sir Ambrose died in the summer of 1795. 5 weeks after the funeral, his heir moved the widow out of Hallamere Court and down the park into the Dower House, the old manor house of Netherwold, a late Tudor building refronted in 1704, with a stone front of 7 bays, with a Tudor hall behind that front, and a chimney stack 11 feet wide. She lived there 14 years and saw almost nobody. She died on a Sunday morning in December 1809, aged 58, and her personal estate was sworn under £200. She left her son, Edmund, her books, a mourning ring, and £11 4 shillings. Harriet's father died in November 1839 of a bad chest in a curate's house with a wet north wall, and left £31 and a box of sermons. There was nowhere for a curate's orphan of 18 to go but to the head of her family, and so that December she went up to Hallamere Court and was given a room on the attic floor and the work of a lady's maid without the wage of one. She did it for 3 years and never complained where anybody could hear her. What ended it was a marriage. In January 1842, Sir Gilbert became engaged to a Miss Loveday of Grantham with £12,000. Settlements had to be drawn, and Honoria, Dowager Lady Ferrand, looked round her house with the eye of a woman making an inventory before company comes, and saw a poor cousin on the attic floor. A poor relation in a house is a question. Somebody always eventually asks what provision was made for the 2nd son's child. Honoria did not permit questions in her house. She preferred receipts. So she instructed Mr. Josiah Peel, attorney of Louth, to make a final provision out of the estate, to take a full release of all claim whatsoever upon it, and to be quick. The provision was the Dower House, which had stood shut for 32 years, and £4. Mr. Peel advised his client twice against the last recital, and said that a recital of that kind bound the party who made it, and could serve no purpose. Lady Ferrand replied that its purpose was that the matter should be closed for ever, and told him to write it as she had said it. He kept his draft, with her alterations in her own hand in the margin, because it was his habit to keep everything, and 4 years later that habit cost her rather more than his bill. The Dower House had been shut since February 1810. Harriet got in at 4 in the afternoon by the scullery window, because the front door was swollen into its frame and would not move for the key. The first thing she learned about her inheritance was that it was colder inside than out. There were 7 bays across the front and 22 rooms behind them, and 141 panes of glass gone. Ivy had come in through the landing window and grown 11 feet along the passage wall. 2 of the ceilings on the top floor were down in heaps on the boards, with the laths standing out of the plaster like ribs. There was a dead rook on the stairs, dried to nothing. In the great hall, which ran the whole depth of the house, the floor was sound, and the panelling was sound, and the wall at the north end was a flat plastered face, with a marble chimney piece against it, and no fireplace opening at all, only a black iron grate standing on the hearthstone in front of the plaster, like a chair pulled up to a wall. She found one room she could hold, on the first floor at the east end, with a small grate that drew, 3 whole windows, and a door that shut. She swept it. She hung her shawl over the broken pane. She lit a fire with lath and ivy wood, and it smoked, and she opened the window to it, and let it smoke. Then, because there was no table, and no shelf, and no flat surface anywhere in that house that was not an inch deep in 32 years of dust, she put the tin candlestick on the stone sill of the east window, and lit it. That night the carrier's cart on the Louth Road came round the shoulder of the park at 7 o'clock, and the carrier stopped his horse. There was a light in the Dutchwoman's house. By Saturday it was in every kitchen in the parish. The jackdaws woke her at first light. There were, she thought, 100 of them living in the hall stack, and they went down and up it all day, dropping sticks, and the sticks came out of the plastered wall at the north end of the hall through a crack by the skirting and lay in a heap on the floor, and she swept them up every morning, and every morning there were more. On the 25th of March, which was Lady Day, the assistant overseer of the poor walked out from Netherwold and served her with a demand for the poor rate on the Dower House, £2 12 shillings for the year. She had £3 and 9 shillings left of the 4. She paid it in full on the doorstep out of the leather purse, in silver, counted into his hand, and asked him for a receipt, and he wrote her one on the back of the demand with a pencil, standing up, and looked at the house behind her and then at her boots, and did not say what he was thinking. That left her 17 shillings and a house with 141 holes in it. And it was that afternoon, walking back from the village with a loaf and a quarter of tea, that Harriet Ferrand stopped being a young woman to whom something had been done and became a working woman. And she was never afterwards anything else. She began at the Ram. Mrs. Rachel Dunnage, who kept it, wanted her back kitchen scoured, gave her a day's work at 10pence and her dinner, watched her do it, and gave her 2 more days. It was Mrs. Dunnage who first said it out loud in her own tap-room, that the Dower House was not the Dutchwoman's house any longer. It was Miss Ferrand's house. And it was Mrs. Dunnage who sent her to Ebenezer Stark. Eb Stark was 66, bricklayer and plasterer of Netherwold, with a bad hip and a good eye, and he wanted a labourer because he could no longer carry a hod up a ladder. He looked at her hands and said she would be no use to him for a fortnight, and then she might be. She was no use to him for 11 days. He taught her lime. He taught her to slake it and sieve it, and leave it under water in a tub for 3 months before she thought about using it. And the first sentence of his she learned by heart was that you cannot hurry lime. And the second was that a wall wants to be dry before it wants to be pretty. He taught her the gauge for coarse stuff, 1 of lime to 3 of sharp sand, and a double handful of ox hair to the hod, and to lay laths a thumb's width apart, and press the first coat through them so the nibs curled over and locked behind, because a ceiling hangs on nothing else. And in the second summer he taught her flues, because his hip would not take a roof any more and hers would. She turned out to be very good at it. She was light. She had small hands. She was not afraid of the inside of a chimney, and she would rather spend an hour finding out why a thing was wrong than 4 hours making a wrong thing look right. She learned that 4 chimneys and 5 smoke for a reason you can put a name to. A flue too wide at the throat, a bird's nest, a broken with, so that one flue steals another's draught. By the end of 1843, there were 3 parishes in which, if the kitchen smoked, somebody's wife said send up to the Dower House for Miss Ferrand. She was paid 6 pence a day and her food for lime washing, and 5 shillings for a flue put right, and she hoarded it in coppers in a tea canister on the mantel-shelf. With it she bought glass at 4 pence the foot, and putty and lead and nails, and glazed 19 windows with her own hands. The parish revised its opinion in stages. In March 1842, she was that poor creature the Ferrands had put out. By the harvest she was the young woman who had paid her rate on the day, in silver, on the doorstep, which in a Lincolnshire village is a character reference that lasts 20 years. By the spring of 1843, she was a tradeswoman that farmers argued over the hiring of. The court took no notice of any of it, which was the single greatest kindness Honoria Ferrand ever did her. Now we come to the sentence. Harriet's father had kept, inside the backboard of his Bible, a half sheet of paper folded to the size of a card, so worn along the fold that it had been backed with a strip of muslin. It was the last thing his mother ever wrote, and it was not finished. It was dated the 14th of December 1809 from the Dower House. The housekeeper had found it on the table on the Sunday morning, with the pen laid across the inkstand, and had sent it on to the second son because it was addressed to him. My dear Edmund, I am not to be pitied and you are not to think me poor. What was my father's is in this house still, in the warmest place in it, and it is yours and no other's. When you come at Christmas I will that is where it stops. Edmund Ferrand came at Christmas. His mother had been buried 9 days. The family read the letter and acted on it, and this is the part that mattered most. In February 1810, Sir Rowland Ferrand had the Dower House turned out by 6 men over 9 days. They took up the kitchen floor, broke open the bread oven and the coppers, dug the cellar down 2 feet, lifted every hearthstone in a house of 22 rooms, stripped the bacon loft and sounded the chimney pieces, and at the end of it they had found a dead jackdaw, a shilling of William III, and a woman's shoe. So the family closed the matter and told, ever afterwards, the story that suited them, that the Dutch woman's money had gone down with her father's house when the French came into Amsterdam in 1795, that there had never been anything to find, and that at the end she had been wandering in her mind. Harriet had read that half-sheet perhaps 100 times in the attic at Hallowmere Court, and in the east room of the Dower House with her shawl over the broken pane. it meant nothing. She had a whole house full of cold rooms, and every one of them was the same temperature. What changed it was a conversation on a roof in October 1843, and Eb Stark was not talking about treasure at all. He was talking about brickwork, because that was the only subject he had. They were on the leads over the hall, pointing the base of the great stack, and she said what she had said before, that the stack was too big for the flues in it. "Course it is," Eb said. "There's a fireplace behind that plaster in the hall the size of a cart shed. I know what's in that stack. I helped fill it." She sat back on her heels. "He was 19, he said, in the autumn of 1795, apprenticed to Josiah Kell. 5 weeks after they buried Sir Ambrose, the old lady sent for his master herself, and paid the bill herself, and had them brick up the great hall fireplace and plaster the face flush across it. 2 days' work for 3 men, and she stood in the hall and watched every course of it go up. When it was done, she gave them a shilling each and a glass of Hollands out of a stone bottle, and told them the room would be warmer without it." "Warmer without a fire?" Harriet said. "That's what she said. And she was right, near enough. That flue drew half the house up it. But my father worked in that hall before I was born, and he always said there was the biggest fire in the parish burning in it of a winter, wide enough to stand 4 men in, shoulder to shoulder. Harriet Ferrand sat on a cold lead roof in the October of 1843, with a trowel in her hand, and did the arithmetic that 6 men in 1810 had not been in a position to do. The great hall fireplace had been bricked up in the autumn of 1795. The letter was written on the 14th of December 1809. The warmest place in that house had been the coldest wall in the building for 14 years by the time the old woman wrote the words down. She had paid to make it so. She had stood over the work and given the men a shilling each to make sure it was done properly, and every one of the 6 men who searched the house in February 1810 had walked past that flat plastered wall in the hall 4 times a day for 9 days, and none of them had ever in their lives seen a fire in it, and not one of them was old enough to know that there had ever been one. She did not go down and open it that afternoon. She finished pointing the stack, because Eb Stark was paying her 1 and 6pence a day, and she had never yet given a man short measure. Then she waited 7 weeks, until the 14th of December, and did not entirely know why she waited for the date, except that it seemed to her the old woman had earned it. She began at 8 in the morning on the 14th of December 1843, alone, with a lath hammer and a cold chisel and 2 candles. The plaster came off in slabs the size of tea trays, and the laths behind it were oak, and had gone hard as iron. Behind the laths was brick, a single skin laid in lime, all stretchers and not a header in it. It had not been built to carry anything. It had been built to be a face. The first brick came out at 2:30. Cold air came out of the hole with it, and 32 years of soot, and a smell like a wet coal cellar. She had the opening clear by dusk, and it was as Eb had said. 11 feet wide, 6 feet deep, an oak bressumer across the top black with old smoke, a floor of stone flags, and soot so thick on the back wall that she could write in it with her finger. You could have stood 4 men in it shoulder to shoulder. There was nothing in it. She stood in her own fireplace with a candle until 9 at night, and she found it because she was a plasterer and not a treasure hunter. In the West Jam, at shoulder height, A patch 4 feet by 3 was not soot-black brick, but soot-black plaster. And when she tapped it, it was hollow, and it did not sound like a flue. Behind it was an oak door, iron-strapped 3 inches thick, shut with a plain sliding bolt, and the bolt had been greased. It was a smoke closet, the little lead-lined chamber built into the thickness of a chimney where the bacon and the hams hang. This one had been swept out and dried and floored with elm boards. On the shelf at the back stood a japanned tin box, a squat lead-cased packet the size of a large loaf sewn up in oiled silk, a pair of brass folding scales in a shagreen case, and a bundle of papers tied with green tape. Harriet carried all of it up to her one warm room and set it on the boards and knelt down and cut the silk with her scissors. Inside the oiled silk was a lead case. Inside the lead case, in 3 paper packets folded like a chemist's, were stones. They were grey and greasy looking. Most were the size of a pea. 4 or 5 were the size of a damson, and one was bigger. They had flat faces and rounded edges, and a skin on them like the skin on a boiled potato. And some were faintly yellow, and 1 or 2 were the color of a dirty window. They looked exactly like a paper of gravel out of the bottom of a lane. The papers were worse, because they were in Dutch. One sheet was in English, a copy of part of a settlement in a clerk's hand, dated the 3rd of June, 1774, concerning Sabine Mesman, spinster, and certain articles to be held to her sole and separate use. And there the copy ended, in the middle of a line. Harriet sat on the floor of a house with 141 broken panes in it, in December, with £3 in a tea canister, and looked at a paper of grit, and understood at last what the family had meant all those years, when they said the old woman had been wandering in her mind. She put the stones on the mantel-shelf. They stayed there 19 days. She kept working. She lime-washed the dairy at Cowpasture Farm the week before Christmas. She paid Eb Stark the 11 shillings she owed him. She ate her Christmas dinner at the Ram, because Mrs. Dunnage would not hear of anything else. And every evening she came back to a cold house and saw the paper of gravel sitting on the shelf. On the 2nd of January, 1844, she was in the parlour trying to cut glass. She had bought a box of seconds glass in Louth, and she could not cut it. She had scored 6 panes with an old file and cracked 5 of them. And she said something about it aloud, and Eb Stark, sitting on an upturned pail eating his bread and bacon, told her what every glazier in England could have told her. You want a diamond, that's all. There's no cutting glass without. Sim Duckett at Louth has got one. Been his father's. It's nobbut a bit of rough stone set in a stick with lead run round it. Keeps it in his waistcoat pocket. He'd sooner lose his wife. Harriet Ferrand put down the file. She went upstairs and came down with the paper open in her hand, took out the biggest stone, the one the size of a damson, laid a cracked pane flat on the bench, and drew the stone across it with the corner of it down, hard, the way she had watched Sim Duckett do it for 4p a time. It went through the glass with a sound like a nail drawn over silk, and the pane fell into 2 pieces under her thumb. Eb Stark stopped chewing. She did it again with a 2nd stone, and a 3rd, and a 4th. She worked through that box of seconds glass for 4 hours by candlelight, and cut with every stone in the paper. 241 stones. 241 cuts. There is nothing else in the natural world that will do that, and every glazier from Louth to Lincoln has known it since his apprenticeship. She did not shout. She sat down on the floor of the great hall, in front of an 11-foot hole in the wall, with the paper in her lap and the candle out. And after a while, Eb Stark, who was 66 and had a bad hip, went home and told nobody anything, and never did, for the rest of his life. She told nobody either, and then she did the most sensible thing anybody in this story ever did. She put the stones back where she had found them, bolted the oak door, plastered the patch flush again with her own coarse stuff, laid new laths across the fireplace opening, and set the first coat through them. And by the end of January, there was a flat, plastered wall at the north end of the hall again, exactly like the wall her grandmother had paid for in 1795. The safest place in England for 241 stones was a house her family had already searched. Then she took 6 of them, sewn into the hem of her shawl, and went to Lincoln. Miss Vardy, watchmaker and jeweller, in the bale, put a glass in his eye, looked at them for less than a minute, handed them back and asked her to put them away. "I cannot value these, madam, and there is not a man in this county who can. Do not show them to another soul between here and where you are going." He wrote a name on a card: Mr. Isaac Blaze, diamond broker of Ely Place, Holborn. She went to London in the 2nd week of February 1844, and sat in a small office off Ely Place in her one good gown, with plaster still under her fingernails, while a man of about 70 went through the bundle of Dutch papers, sheet by sheet, in silence, for 20 minutes. Then he took his spectacles off. "This is an invoice of the house of Messman and Zoon of Amsterdam, dated May 1774. A parcel of rough diamonds and sapphires delivered to the account of Sabine Messman, spinster, to her sole and separate use, by the direction of Abraham Messman, her father, with the weights of every stone set out." The second paper is the certificate, and the third a memorandum in her own hand of stones added afterwards, the last in 1806. He put the spectacles back on. "Your grandmother did not hide a fortune, madam. She kept her own property where her husband's family could not reach it, which is what her father intended when he settled it upon her in that form, and then she died on a December morning with the letter unfinished. The parcel weighed 960 carats. Mr. Blaise valued it as it stood at £9,600, and undertook the cutting and sale of it over the 3 years that followed, and it realized in the end £15,300, of which Harriet Ferrand received, after commission and every charge, a little under 14,000. You cannot keep a thing like that quiet in a county, and she did not particularly try. It was in the Lincoln paper in a paragraph of 5 lines in April 1844, and at Hallowmere Court it was read aloud at breakfast. Mr. Peel wrote within the week, requiring delivery up of certain articles alleged to be heirlooms of the family, and then offered £900 and the cancelling of the whole transaction. Refused twice with 2 sentences of perfect courtesy, Lady Ferrand filed her bill in Chancery in the spring of 1845, and Ferrand against Ferrand was heard on and off for 14 months. She said 3 things: that the stones were heirlooms, and passed with the baronetcy; that if they had been Sabine's own, they went on her death to her personal representatives, and so came round again to the estate; and that the defendant had known of them before the 3rd of March, 1842, and had concealed it to obtain the conveyance. Harriet Ferrand answered all 3 in the order that hurt most. The settlement of the 3rd of June 1774, with the Amsterdam invoice attached, which put the stones outside the family's property before Sabine Mesman had been a Ferrand for a single day. The will of Sabine, Lady Ferrand, proved at Lincoln in 1810, giving all her separate estate whatsoever to her son Edmund and his issue. And Edmund's issue was one person, sitting in the 3rd row of the court in a grey gown, and the conveyance of the 3rd of March 1842, by which the plaintiff had granted away the house together, with all goods, chattels, furniture, plate, lumber, glass, ironwork, and other things whatsoever then remaining within the walls thereof, absolutely. And then, at the end, the recital. Mr. Peel was called by his own former client, and had to identify his draft and the alterations in the margin, say in whose hand they were, and admit that he had advised against them twice, and been overruled. Counsel read the words out slowly to a full court, that no inventory hath been made or shall be required, the same having been searched throughout in the year 1810, and found void of anything of value. She had put it in so that nobody could ever say the Ferrands kept back anything from the second son's child. It was the one sentence in the deed that was entirely her own work, and it made it impossible for her to say in a court of equity that the house had been full of her family's fortune all along. The Vice-Chancellor dismissed the bill in June 1846 with costs, and said one line that went round the county within a fortnight, and was still being repeated at Louth Market 20 years later. The defendant holds by 3 several titles, of which any one would have served. The plaintiff drew 2 of them herself. The costs were £840. They fell on a house that could not carry them. Sir Gilbert Ferrand had gone into railway scrip in the spring of 1845 like half the gentlemen in England, and had been called on for the balance twice over, and Hallamere Court was mortgaged that October to a Lincoln bank for £9,000. In the hard money of 1846, the bank wanted out of a country mortgage on thin wold land, and it wanted out quietly. In October 1846, the mortgage was assigned, the bank was paid £9,000, and the assignee was Miss Harriet Ferrand of the Dower House, in the parish of Netherwold. She did not foreclose. She never at any point threatened to. She wrote to her cousin 1 letter of 6 lines, confirming that the interest would be payable half-yearly as before, at 4.5 in the 100, and that it should be paid at the Dower House. She bought other things that year with more pleasure. Cow pasture farm, 310 acres, where she had lime-washed the dairy for 6pence a day. The Netherwold brickyard, of which she made Ebenezer Stark the manager at 30 shillings a week and a house, and where he sat in an office with a stove and told younger men that you cannot hurry lime. And she put the Dower House back. It took 2 years and rather more than £3,000, a new roof of Collyweston slate, every one of the 7 bays reglazed, and the 2 fallen ceilings run again in her own coarse stuff, set through the laths by her own hand on the scaffold for the pleasure of it. In the rate book for 1847, the entry was altered from the Dower House, empty, no rate, to Ferrand, Harriet, the old house, Netherwold, and she was that year the largest ratepayer in the parish. The last thing she did was the wall at the north end of the hall. She took it down herself in the September of 1846, plaster, laths and brick, had the 11-foot opening swept and a fireback cast, and Eb Stark rebuilt the throat of the flue a foot narrower, so that it would draw without pulling the doors of the house open. On the 11th of January 1847, the Christmas half-year's interest fell due on the mortgage of Hallowmere Court, and Honoria, Dowager Lady Ferrand, brought it herself, in a bank envelope in the carriage, on a morning of hard white frost. She could have sent it with a groom. She came herself because she was 60 by then, and tidy, and because a debt paid by a servant is a thing said behind your back, and she had decided to say it to the woman's face and be finished with it. The gates of the old house stood open, and there were lamps lit in all 7 bays of the front. And straight up out of the great stack, standing in the frozen air above that house for the first time since the autumn of 1795, went a column of wood smoke. She was shown into the great hall. At the north end of it, in an opening 11 feet wide and 6 feet deep that you could have stood 4 men in shoulder to shoulder, ash logs were burning on a new iron fireback, and the heat of it came out across 30 feet of oak floor. Harriet Ferrand came in from the yard in a grey working gown with plaster on her cuffs, and asked her aunt to sit down, and had her chair set in the warmest place in the room, to the left of the hearth, out of the draught. The receipt was written and signed and handed over, and it took 4 minutes, and neither of them said one unnecessary word, because both had been raised in the same school of manners, and both were extremely good at it. At the door, Honoria Ferrand stopped, with her glove half on. "How did you know where to look?" "You told me," Harriet said. "You had it written on the deed that the house was searched in 1810 and found void of anything of value. You put it in twice. Everybody who ever searched this house was looking for a warm place, and they were right to. They were only 14 years too late to know which one she meant." She took a half-sheet of paper out of her pocket, backed with a strip of muslin along the fold, and did not hand it over, and read it out instead, standing in her own hall with the fire behind her. "I am not to be pitied, and you are not to think me poor. What was my father's is in this house still, in the warmest place in it, and it is yours and no other's." Outside, the jackdaws came off the ridge and went round the stack twice and settled on the church tower instead, because the chimney they had lived in for 32 years had a fire under it at last. They had nested over an oak door with a greased bolt every spring of those 32 years, and had never once carried off the one thing in it worth taking. It did not shine.